Dmytro Yesypenko is a research fellow at Taras Shevchenko Institute, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, Kyiv. His area of specialization includes literary source studies and book history, issues of textual scholarship and scholarly editing, Ukrainian historical and literary process of the 19th and 20th century Slavic literatures. Dmytro's monograph on Ukrainian novelist Borys Hrinchenko was published in 2015 by Naukova dumka. Dmytro is also one of the co-editors of Cossacks in Jamaica, Ukraine, and the Antipodes essays in honor of Marko Pavlyshyn, which was published in 2020. We will start with Dmytro Yesypenko's lecture. Please submit your comments and questions via our Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion. So Dmytro Yesypenko today is presenting on There is Nothing New Under the Sun, Ukrainian authors on the epidemics of the 19th century. Thank you so much, Dmytro, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for this introduction, and many thanks for the invitation. I think that this initiative of promotion Ukrainian studies, Ukrainian research at Indiana University, including in this YouTube format, but also your conferences, is definitely very valuable and deserves the highest praise and full support. My today's talk is indeed, as you mentioned, it's relevant and it's timely. It concerns the past events that have obvious connection with our present. And someone might say that, isn't it too much talking about epidemics of the past during the ongoing pandemic? And someone might think that this presentation will be too focused on negative things. I was thinking actually about this as well while writing this paper and while being sick with COVID-19. And in what is following, I shall try to explain why, in my view, it still was talking exactly at this period of time. I will share my presentation with you now. I hope you can see it. So this is the first page. So since March of 2020, we have noticed a significant interest in not only films about epidemics, but also in literary text about pandemics. This might be explained particularly by the fact of this very convenient, very easily accessible format of book, for example, Albert Camus' La Peste, in comparison with historical studies on the waves of epidemics in Europe or in Africa. People, as always, are curious to learn other people's stories, especially in the case where this is stories of their own ancestors. It's interesting to learn about thousands and millions of people who were fighters or unfortunately victims of all these epidemics of cholera, of plague, first of all plague, of course, of typhus, of smallpox, and others. And there is unfortunately quite a little space for memory about these events, about these people in our everyday life. No, we try to forget some bad things, and we have nowadays almost complete lack of monuments about these events, about exactly events of the 19th century. Because if we can see on the screen on the right side this plaque pillar or plaque column from the 17th century. Such constructions on new churches were built at that time to celebrate the end of plague. But in the 18th century, in the 19th centuries, there are only a few such monuments. It's hard to find many monuments in the cultural landscapes of cities, of rural areas, of Europe, of North America as well. The narratives, these narratives of cholera, narrative of later Spanish fever, they appear to be too hard to represent in a sculpture form or in an architecture form. In the situation of ongoing stress and meeting with seemingly new threat, this COVID, seemingly for at least many or most countries of the West, people need advice, need kind of tips from their predecessors. And we might be comforted by the fact that such or similar threats have already occurred, and quite many times. It was like this before, and those epidemics lasted longer, and it was much more harder and difficult to pass all these trials. The trials of the 20th century, I mean wars, famines, displacements, relocations, national disasters, all this kind of covered the experience of the previous centuries, draw attention from 19th century, for instance. And this 19th century is especially important for understanding Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian historical context. This is precisely the time when a modern nation, Ukrainians, start creating its formative period. And the role of Ukrainian literature in this formation can hardly be overestimated. Among other things, Ukrainian writers of the 19th century actively engaged in creating national myths, in collecting and preserving of national history and folklore. That means that they preserved for us not only the individual particular views in the literary text, but also this form of everyday life, of vernacular culture, that present views of a larger communities of people, not just their own. And it seems that it's quite a relevant and useful approach to compare these individual views with those that appear in folklore texts. Ukrainian writers themselves, as we know, often come from this living folklore world of Ukrainian rural areas, Ukrainian countryside, and they actively used legends, folklore stories, or write from the peasants these stories. Mykola Kostomarov did this, Panteleimon Kulish, Taras Shevchenko, Ivan Franko, whom we can see on the screen right in the center of this photo. In some way, all these writers were not only writers, but also pre-folklorists and pre-historians. In this talk, I shall bring to your attention a few poems, just a few, and few prose works written by both renowned Ukrainian classics, but also less known writers. The list of considered issues will include the issue of naming or anonymity of epidemics, and plaque as a universal image, and connections of literary text with folklore text and with history. This presentation will study how literary texts cover both the breadth and depth of the phenomena, with a focus on very personal experiences and losses, how they reveal dramas of loneliness and orphanhood of protagonists or characters of these stories. And it will be a combination of literary texts and historical context and folklore text as well. And there are 2 points that I would like to mention at the very beginning. The first one is that I'm quite new in this research stream, so I'll be very grateful for any comments, any suggestions and questions, of course. And the second one is that although this topic seems to be quite complex and, you know, in a dark side, in dark colors, but it's still about life, because this phenomena, kind of plague or cholera, they help to better appreciate the health life. And for me, at least for me, it's still talking about life, not about just about illness. The names of plague and cholera will be mentioned most often during my presentation. The first has been the main threat to many generations of people for several centuries. As will be shown, the plague has become a kind of embodiment and incarnation of all contagious diseases, of all epidemics, and we will see this in text of Ukrainian writers. Unlike plague, cholera is a disease of the exactly 19th century. It did not appear in Europe in previous centuries, in subsequent centuries. And in this 19th century, cholera surpassed the plague and all other contagious diseases in terms of number of victims, in terms of number of deaths, unfortunately, both in Europe and in the Russian Empire, because we have to take in mind that Ukrainian literature is about events and about characters from different state organizations of that time. And the largest outbreaks of cholera date back to early 1830s and 1840s, and it will be very easy to trace these outbreaks in works in prose by Ivan Franko and in poetry by Taras Shevchenko. What should be mentioned that by the 19th century, cholera spread course of this disease in the Russian Empire proceeded in much the same way as in Europe. When it first came to Europe exactly from the Russian Empire in 1831, it did not meet with effective resistance in Europe. It the same way took terrible harvest of people's lives there too. For a long time, Europeans underestimated cholera, and it was called kind of the disease of backward East, from somewhere from Asia. Cholera and other diseases were remarkably effectively carried by the military companies. The Russian, for instance, Russian troops that were sent from Russia, of course, to suppress Polish uprising in 1830, 1831, contributed to the spread of cholera among local residents. And my suggestion is to start exactly with this region, which is today's Western Ukraine, from the territory that was part of Austria at that time, from Eastern Galicia, or officially known as Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, with its center in Lviv, in Lemberg. There were a high number of cases of cholera, and death rate reached up to 40 and even 50% on this land in the early 1830s. One of the most famous Ukrainian writers and cultural figures, Ivan Franko, has a few texts that might help us to understand what was happening there at that time in Galicia and how people met and experienced the cholera epidemic. The first, his text is titled «Сожжение упырей в селе Нагуевичах» в 1831 году. This is a non-fiction by Franko, written in 1890 in rather captivating and emotional manner. The story tells about the burning of people in the native village of Ivan Franko, which is today in Lviv region, Naguyevichi. Franko's article is based on his own memories, on the memories from local residents, and on travel notes from by the visitors to that time Galicia. This text describes very impressive details of this virtually medieval executions which had not happened on these lands for many decades before, or even century before this particular case. According to popular beliefs of that time among peasants, I mean, uperi or operi, in translation you might say ghouls or vampires, but I would prefer the form ghouls. So these ghouls were suspected as those responsible for the spread of epidemics for the scourge. As it was believed, these ghouls, uperi, they potinali in Ukrainian, which means literally cut people like grass. At the height of cholera in 1831, the powerless in face of disease and deeply frustrated peasants tried to stop spreading epidemic in every possible way. And they believed that it was kind of magical cause, magical intervention from others, and they were looking for these others, and they received information about particular local residents that were believed to be a ghouls. One of the fellows, young boy, says that they were ghouls, and he said about the signs of this ghouls uperi. One of these signs were thick body hair, while the other sign was a distinctive bandage on the legs. Unfortunate fellows, some of them, about 10, were captured, interrogated. They argued that they put on these bandages on the legs to protect themselves from cholera. So they do this the same way as, for example, last year in 2020, many people wore different amulets or use some questionable devices in order to protect themselves from coronavirus. So in Naguyevichi, those treated by peasants in this village, treated as ghouls, they were forced to go through a huge bonfire. And of course, we do understand that not all of them survived after that. And this place of burning people for many years remained a black place known for most of the local residents. Franko wrote about the same outbreak, so again 1830s, early 1830s, but from a different point of view, from a more urban perspective in his fictional story that is titled Boa Constrictor. So boa constrictor, it's a large species of snake. This macabre and powerful snake that strangles its victims is an allusion to the protagonist of the novel, Hermann Goldkramer, gold dealer in translation from German. This Hermann is a wealthy and cruel owner of oil wells in Borislav in the Lviv region. This is a character of Gobseck type, I mean Honor Balzac's Gobseck, because he accumulates wealth without getting joys out of his life. And why, we may ask. The answer is that his curse is in his childhood. The memories of this childhood poisons his present life. And the main reason for the tragedies of his early years was exactly cholera. This disease claimed lives of his father, of his brother. The boy Hermann actually did not know them. His father, his brother worked collecting and selling rags, and they fell victims to the epidemic. Merchants, history tells us that merchants were among the main distributors of cholera and other contagious diseases. And Jews, because Hermann Goldkramer is of course a Jew, so Jews often made a living by trading, which means they traveled more and had more contacts with different people. They had more potential contacts with carriers of diseases. So Hermann is half-orphan boy. He is raised by his mother, and new, even stronger stroke of misfortune falls on the boy later, when in 1831, cholera engulfs Galicia. The novel's lines, this one cited, resemble the biblical punishments from the book of Apocalypse of John. We can also find references to the already mentioned Franko's article, to this сожжение упырей, burning ghouls, when it comes to ghouls and violence against them in local villages. However, Franko's focus is not only and not so much on the common scourge of the mass epidemic as on the personal dimension. The loss of his mother becomes a terribly painful experience for the protagonist, who is still a young boy. Hermann becomes a powerless witness to his mother's last hours, realizing that she herself is a danger for own son, that she can infect him. The then mother asks not to come to her, not to come near her. Furthermore, and this is important to emphasize, that she asked him to live honestly. And Hermann became an orphan, and unfortunately he would not be able to live accordingly to his mother's last words. Life trials and dramas rooted in his childhood hardened Hermann, made him indifferent to other people's pain and suffering. In his Boa Constrictor, Ivan Franko supports one of the prevailing theories at that time about the causes of cholera, the so-called miasmatic theory. In this matter, the novel of Ukrainian author resonates with many other literary texts from different literatures, from different centuries even. But first, it's worth making a brief reminder about the nature of cholera from our today's knowledge. It's an infectious disease that spreads mainly with contaminated water. The course of cholera is dynamic, just a few days. It's accompanied by rapid dehydration and diarrhea. The most common cause of death is actually the loss of vital fluids and electrolytes by the human body. This is from the point of modern knowledge, of our today's knowledge about this disease. However, for a long time, for many centuries, neither the nature of its distribution nor effective methods of treatment were known. In 1848, John Snow suggested that cholera is a contagious disease that develops in the victim's bodies and spreads through their feces and vomit, mainly through contaminated water. 30 years later, in 1883, Robert Koch discovered the causative agent of cholera, the bacterium Vibrio cholera. Throughout the entire 19th century and even in the 20th century, we can see in the works by Ukrainian authors, and not only Ukrainian, that they emphasize not so much dirty contaminated water as infectious soil and especially air, bad air, or sometimes night air, and wind that spreading epidemics. The miasmatic theory substantiated that cholera is a product of miasma. It's kind of both winds and humidity and topography, all of that. And we can see that in the works of other classics from other literatures, for instance, Thomas Mann and his Der Tod in Venedig, and Albert Camus and his La Peste. We can see how the wind spreads cholera or plague, and how cholera matures in rotten stagnant air in this text. We read about diseased, poisoned sirocco. Sirocco, this is the south wind in Thomas Mann's text. Cholera in his novel, in Mann's novel, is associated with miasmatic theory, although the text was written 30 years after findings by Robert Koch. Camus' description of the plague in Iran, because it's of course plague in Camus' text, but it might be based on, again, cholera outbreak that killed a large percentage of cities' population of these Algerian cities in 1898. So Camus wrote about 1940s, but the outbreak was a century before. In both texts, in Thomas Mann's text, in Albert Camus' text, the protagonists associate the spread of this disease with bad air, with specific location of the cities, but very different location actually. Oran in Algiers and Venice in Italy. We see similar descriptions in Franko's boa constrictor, where the cholera infection is clearly tied to the stinky and musty air of a particular area. This area is overpopulated, overcrowded Jewish district in Drohobych. It's called Lan. Here we can mention the prejudice in Ukrainian folklore texts towards the places where Jews lived as unclean and unpleasant, those that should not be visited. This is in folklore. And this prejudice appeared on the pages of literary texts of previous times, of previous decades. For instance, example of dirty Jewish district in Warsaw from Taras Bulba by Mykola Nikolai Gogol. As for Franko's story, in boa constrictor, the place which should have been a space of life, a sweet, sweet home, this place in fact appeared to be a trap from which its inhabitants strive to get out, but they cannot. Literary descriptions of the deadly rampart of cholera, precisely in this Jewish district, these descriptions have historical confirmations. One of the historians of cholera in Russian Empire in the 19th century, Roderick Magru, he mentioned a particularly harsh outbreak of cholera in Podillia and Volyn in 1830s with the hardest hit exactly to the Jewish population. For instance, the rate of mortality was almost 100% in Berdychev of Zhytomyr region. Franko's texts are interesting and important because they raise another problem that is very relevant then and now, namely people's confidence in physicians and confidence in vaccines. During the whole 19th century, the level of medical care of residents of cities and especially rural areas was very low, and this applies both to the Russian Empire and Galicia. Many folklore texts show that sick rural people place their hopes for recovery rather on their family members, usually on elderly women or a local healers, or witch doctors, целители, знахари. Even when peasants had an opportunity to call a physician, they rather did not do this. It was often believed that doctors' intention was to take the sick persons to the hospitals in order to make kind of experiments with their bodies, make an autopsy, for instance. In this famous text, Перехресні стежки by Ivan Franko, the author shows that such fears of the peasants unfortunately had certain grounds. The protagonist of the novel visits one of the Galician villages and witnesses the mass funeral processions. He is struck to learn that those dead are children who were vaccinated with a spoiled smallpox vaccine by a local physician. The children's parents are desperate to seek justice, but they have no faith that this physician will be punished by local authorities. The reader of the novel gets an impression that such incidents were not isolated cases and that lives of people from the lower social strata and representatives of non-titular nation, non-Polish, non-Jewish, but just Ukrainians. So their lives did not have a high value for the authorities because this doctor, this physician is definitely a representative of authorities, at least in the views of peasants. The vaccine in Franko's text, it's not only about medical treatment, it's also about kind of metaphorical redefining, I may say so. In his preface to another famous work, it's his collection Ziv'yale Listya, Ivan Franko uses it as a metaphor of healing. He compares benefits of his own poetry, exactly sad and pessimistic poetry. He compares it to the fighting smallpox with vaccination. Franko definitely knew that since the late 18th century, smallpox was fought by vaccination with cowpox virus. And Edward Jenner, whom we can see here, he was the scientist who proved that localized cowpox infection can help with immunity against smallpox. And that's why in this picture we can see cow in the window. So this was actually the invention of the first vaccine in human history. We see in Ukrainian literature not only a literal reflection of epidemics, but also interesting examples of rethinking, redefining, metaphorization of this phenomena. And Ivan Franko's text, another text, it's a short story, The Plague, Chuma. It's not about bodily illness of the past, but about contemporary threat, about the threat of spiritual enslavement of Ukrainian peasants by Roman Catholic Church, namely by Jesuits. Again, similarly as in Boa Constrictor, as in Prehresny Steshki, in this text, in The Plague, the epidemic issue has a clear social ground, social connotation, social meaning. This is not the last possible example from Ivan Franko's both fiction and non-fiction text. He's one of the most productive Ukrainian writers, but I would propose to move our attention to the central Ukraine, or as it was called at that time, Nadnipranska Ukraina, which of course was a part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, to move attention from brilliant Franko's prose to the finest examples of Ukrainian poetry. Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko again has, but not prose, but he has a poem with the same title, Chuma, Plague. It was written in 1848, that means exactly during the outbreak of cholera. And this year, 1848, again, it became the most fatal year in the entire history of epidemics in the Russian Empire. According to incomplete statistics, there were almost 2 million cases and almost 700 deaths from cholera, just in 1 year. At first glance, we can see in this poem that it's about plague. It's not about cholera. It's about this powerful epidemics of the previous centuries. But things get less simple if we take a look at the autograph of this poem, of this work, of the original version. And here we can see that at first, the first lines of this poem sounded like Cholera z zastupom chodila, Cholera was wandering with a spade, and then poet changed them to Chuma z lopatою chodila, Plague was wandering with a shovel. And why Shevchenko did this? What message did he want to convey to his readers by these changes? Unlike the Plague, at that time, at the end of 1840s, cholera was still a new threat, a new disease. Shevchenko's description of fight against the spread in this particular text is close to the struggle against the plague. It was during the plague that military units got the affected area locked up, with restricted access from outside, with prohibition from leaving this territory. We can see on the screen the village in an open field turns green like an oasis no one enters. Here, yes. The houses were surrounded by moats and then burned. I quote, "Greenery lingered in the village till people from the field sparked a blaze. Burning down the verdant village, it burned and smoldered." Worship, religious ceremonies were banned too. Quote, "It's been long since bells have rung." The mentioned in the poem Hrobokopateli, or Diggers of the Graves, in Petrofedinsky's translation, their sextons. So they were cloaked in tar and leather, and they were those employed for this hard, for this dangerous work, and they needed some kind of protective clothing. We see this in this line. The tar should help to protect the body from infection. So Shevchenko knew less about the new pestilence that had replaced the plague. The poet had reasons to believe that cholera was still less known to his readers, to peasants. That's why he chose the more commonly understood and more familiar image of the plague. The journey through the territory of Ukraine continues to the south, namely to Odessa. In another poem, which is titled "Ой, не п'ються пива меди," Shevchenko mentions this port city, the main port on the Black Sea, and cholera reached it at the end of May 1848 on a ship from Istanbul. Lack of drinking of clean water was the main reason for cholera outbreak. At that time, in the previous years, in the subsequent years, starting from 1831 to 1892. In the poem, we can the translation "Ой, не п'ються пива меди," it's "he'll drink no more the beer and meat." Shevchenko again here does not call cholera. He tells about the plague. Chumak is the protagonist of this poem, and it's worth mentioning that chumak, this word, is connected, at least in folk etymology, with the word chuma, plague. There is no reasons to expect that this romanticist poem will explain and give a clear answer on whether Shevchenko was writing about the named plague or unnamed cholera, but more relevant cholera for that time at least. For the first disease, one of the symptoms mentioned in poetry are more inherent. A grievous aching smote his head, pangs on his belly, grievous aching smote his head. It's more relevant for plague, and pangs on his belly pray, it's a symptom rather of cholera. Those sick with both cholera and plague often experience thirst, nausea, and chumak, drink no more the beer and meat. Another symptom is more often a sign of cholera. He fell beside his wagon down, and where he fell, he lay. What is more important is that this very individual plots, for instance, bright hyperbola in this text, when Chumak believes the toxin of the disease, of this cholera or plague, lies upon him so much that he predicts the death of the rooks that would who would taste his dead body. Shevchenko text, in fact, both of the above mentioned texts, plague and Ой, не п'ються пива меди, reveal the characteristic and dramatic feature of infectious diseases in general, when the social end of a person, of sick person, precedes the physical end. I mean, the loneliness of the suffering sick protagonist, and this is very unusual circumstance because his comrades left dying Chumak alone, that is, together with his oxen, but still alone, without any other people. Chumaks had very close relations. We know that from history. They relied on themselves much during the long and dangerous trips. And in this case, in this poem, they did not look after their sworn brothers. They did not do what they should do. And what they did not do what, by the way, is described in other texts by Shevchenko, in his other poems, and described in Ukrainian folklore, in the texts that tell about the death of Chumaks on their way home. In both texts, in Plaque and He'll Drink No More the Beer and Meat, or in Epidemics, Shevchenko speaks out and reflects on the phenomenon of death without trace, a death away from relatives, away from closest and loved ones, even without own grave. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of the opportunity for everybody, for everyone, to say goodbye to relatives and friends for the last time, to be buried in the proper way, in the right way, with dignity. Both in Franko's prose and in Shevchenko's poetry, we see examples of disrupted funeral and burial rituals. We notice the treatment of human body as just a physical object that needs to be disinfected and got rid of. And these descriptions, these ideas, are paralleled with the texts from other literatures written by, for example, Daniel Defoe and Albert Camus. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year is a very famous text about epidemics. He tells about the story of the Great Plague in London in 1665. That was the last epidemic in the city. And what Defoe's protagonist eyewitnessed is very similar to what Franko's characters see in the streets of Drohobych 200 years later. And just like in Shevchenko's poem, we see in Defoe's novel the image of bells, of silenced bells. We read about London in the mid-17th century, about Algerian Oran of the mid-20th century, and about Drohobych and the unnamed Ukrainian village from the middle of the 19th century, and we see same emotions, the same dramas, same tragedies of people who lost loved ones and cannot say the last goodbye to them. Shevchenko definitely knew this emotion because he felt this emotion deeply because he lost a number of acquaintances during cholera years, and he lost his sister with her own family exactly at that time. So in his poetry, Shevchenko intuitively made a very right choice to name cholera as a plague, because the scale of cholera at that time and its fatal outcomes of this disease were exactly the same or even more than for plague in the previous centuries. Cholera justified this choice, and cholera indeed replaced the deadly epidemic of the previous, of the 17th, 16th centuries, and in some sense, cholera even surpassed the plague. In the third part, I would like to make kind of digest, kind of summary based on mainly prose works written by Ukrainian writers, novels, short stories, and they mostly written in the second half of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. This topic, as a rule, was not very central for Ukrainian writers, but it was still very important for authors in the plot when they were creating this plot, unfolding it and develop, because significant number of texts begin exactly with the mention of loss of a family member or members because of cholera, because of other epidemics. The protagonist, for instance, in one of the texts of Ukrainian writers, Hanna Barvinuk, we can see a sample of this in her story "Не було змалку, не буде достанку." The protagonist was orphaned at the age of 10. Her parents died within just 1 week from some kind of scourge, so people even did not know the reason for the death. Vidyakois promori, it was written in the text. Another Hanna Barvinuk's text, you can see the quote here, Hanna Barvinuk, Mon Blossom. He wrote about terrible cholera, the first unknown, unexpected, that took away people in large numbers, swept them away like from a broomstick, depopulated villages and orphaned children. End of quote. So these characters are both parents, its husband, its child, and no wonder it's very symbolic title, Scorching its seed. It's a blossom of their lives, and they lost this blossom. Panas Myrny writes about a girl growing up without her parents who died of cholera in his short story Lihий попутав, the evil one did it. What does it mean to become an orphan at that time? And Myrny describes this. At that time, it meant at best to be a servant at the relative's house, or at worst, that meant to live constantly cold and starving life, wandering among strangers. In one of the most famous prose works, again written by Panas Myrny in novel Хіба ревуть воли, як ясла повні, the writer emphasized the constant presence of epidemics in the life of peasants. The disease come back again and again, taking the lives of people from different generations. For instance, main protagonist of this text, Chipka, he did not know his grandmother, while his friend Hrychenko did not know his parents. So in different generations, there are losses of cholera again and again. Sometimes, as I said, people even didn't know that was precisely cholera. On the one hand, cholera raged more in the houses of poor peasants because they did not follow the basic hygiene rules. They did not know these rules. However, the disease did not care much whether its victim was a rich man or a beggar. For instance, in Alexander Konyski text, his novel Semen Zhuk, we see the death of wealthy landowner, of Pan, not Selenin, but Pan. And Konyski even specifies the year and season when it happened, the summer of 1866. It's very precise because it was the first pandemic of cholera at that time. And it's very precise because summer has always been the most favorable period for the outbreak of cholera. We have a very interesting example in Markovovchuk's story, his famous story Institutka, or in translation after finishing school, because as we know, Ukraine is a multicultural country, many languages and cultures are mixed, many people from representatives of different ethnic groups and nationalities live together. And when we consider the history of epidemics, we are talking not only about the fates of Ukrainians, of ethnic Ukrainians, but also about representatives of other ethnic groups. And I have mentioned the tragedies of childhood of Herman in Boa Constrictor by Franko, of this Jewish boy from Galicia. And here, between the lines of Markovovchuk's text, we may read the story of Moskal, of soldier. And I would say that in this translation, why I put two versions, because in this translation, in English one, army orphanage, that means that this character, this boy, was a son of soldier. But it's not the full truth. It's kind of simplifying of the concept of Cantonist. Cantonists were also Jewish boys who were recruited to the Tsarist army as a rule at the age of 12. The reason for this recruitment was assimilation, making Jews Orthodox believers. So this boy, of course, can be a son of a soldier, or he could be a son of Jewish family, or he could be an orphan. And we read in the story that poor fellow Cantonists, many of them died of cholera, and this one is survived. Another ethnic group, another people who lived with Ukrainians, close to Ukrainians for centuries, they were Romani people. And despite the persistent stereotype, in Eastern Europe, they mostly were not nomads, so they were not travelers. They were rather settled and usually separated from other communities, in this case from local Ukrainian community. And intervention of epidemics and cholera again led to changes in the way of life. And we have a sample from Olha Kobylianska's famous text, her novel Zemlya. where she wrote that in 1866, 1867, my quote will be in Ukrainian, and you can see English translation. So in these years запанував голод, прокинулася холера, багацько родин вимерло, багацько вивандрували з Циганії до Молдави, а ті, що осталися на місці, змішалися з іншими мешканцями, і лише небагато з них осталося вірними своїм традиціям і обичаям. End of quote. One of the main characters of this novel, a mystical Roma maiden, her name is Rahira. She makes a Ukrainian guy fall in love with her and encourages him to commit a crime, to kill his own brother. But why she did that? It was kind of revenge from a stranger, from this lost community, lost Roma community. And she takes revenge on the Ukrainian community for the rejection of her. So when we're speaking about these usual problems in such novel as Zemlya, about the problem of killing a brother, fratricide crime, or about the problem of lack of land, we should probably speak also about the issues of assimilation, of immigration and interethnic relations. And that was exactly the strikes of epidemics that triggered the processes of social changes and ethnic perturbations at that time. We might get impression that it would be a rather accurate impression if you'd say that cholera dominates among all other epidemics. But I have already mentioned plague, smallpox, and here will be typhus. And again, Olha Kobylianska, another famous novel, Людина, a person. In this novel, she introduces the story of protagonist's unhappy and unlucky love. Unlucky because her beloved is gone, he has died of typhus. And that's all from the story, but here is a very remarkable coincidence. As we know, Kobylianska is one of the leading authors who wrote about the issues of female emancipation, and she dedicated this novel to Natalia Kobrinska, who again, her colleague, like-minded person. She can be called one of the first Ukrainian feminists. Here we can see Olha Kobylianska and here Natalia Kobrinska. So Kobylianska dedicated to Kobrinska her novel exactly the one where she speaks of typhus, and this is from typhus that Kobrinska would die 2 decades later. So unfortunately, it was imagined. It wasn't imagined disease. Epidemics took not only lives of these characters, fictional characters from literary text, but also many very real people, including the creators of this literary fiction. Here we can say a few points for conclusions that this text of Ukrainian writers of the 19th century and early 20th century, they represent a very broad and representative, sometimes very realistic and precise, but sometimes surprisingly metaphorical descriptions of epidemics. More importantly, they clarify and explain the spirit and key symbols of the time, like silenced bells in Shevchenko poetry and in Daniel Defoe's prose. The general tone of literary text is, of course, uneasy, dramatic, tragic. It's definitely dark colors. But we can see and notice the manifestation, appearance, and development of those best qualities in people, in human civilization as a whole, these qualities that improved even in times of crisis. The text of Ukrainian literature of that time is full of empathy, of compassion, and these texts give voices not only to Ukrainians, but also representatives of other ethnic groups who suffered greatly during the epidemics. First of all, this applies to Jews who experienced especially grave consequences of cholera in the mid-19th century due to the peculiarities of self-government, due to the particular living conditions, the communication with local authorities, with Russian authorities, for instance. And epidemics, it was in particular epidemics that forced Roma people to leave the places where they lived along with Ukrainians and to look for other people, to search for other people for living. By the way, it makes a noticeable difference between literary texts and folklore texts, not only Ukrainian folklore, but also Slavic folklore in broader sense. In one of the legends of, we have kind of stigmatization of both Jewish people and Roma people in folklore. In one of the legends, Ukrainian folklore legend, Jewish people, they circled the houses with a shared cross, and cholera does not affect them. So Ukrainians died while Jewish people remained alive. In Macedonian folklore, it's about Roma people, about gypsies. They often imagined old women or gypsy old women as a plague. It kind of image of plague. It's old woman in this folklore. So literary texts provide own voices for ethnic communities, large ethnic communities, but also for large voiceless communities of the same Ukrainians. I mean, social marginalized groups. We have much more information about the cause of epidemics in towns and in cities. This is because physicians lived there, they worked there, they tracing the number, tracing conditions of the patients, and most of the authors of memoirs lived exactly in cities, in big cities, in provincial centers as a rule. But the heat of epidemic and epidemics made even more significant losses exactly on peasantry, on serfs in particular. And from this perspective of view, it's very important to trace these particular single evidences about the epidemic times in rural areas. It's of particular importance to find them, and we can find them exactly in literary texts. I mean, not only documentary and authentic evidence, as for example in one Franko's Serhy, not only this evidence is from folklore texts, but also imaginary, intuitive, unique pictures like in Taras Shevchenko's poem Chuma. We can also see the controversies in the image of key players in this deadly game with diseases, with epidemics. I mean the perception of physicians' work by other characters, by peasants, for instance. On one hand, we have cases of medical malpractice with vaccinated children in the novel Перехресні стежки. On the other, there are calls to use medical services. The same again, Franko stressed the benefits of vaccines. Another writer, Stepan Nis, his advices are especially relevant because he himself was a doctor, in addition to activities in literary field, in folklore studies, and he even wrote a book, Pro Cholera, on cholera. In 1875, he published this book, and there he lists for his fellow peasants hygiene procedures and solutions from traditional medicine, and he strongly recommends calling a doctor in case of more severe illnesses. To call a good doctor, he adds, and it's hard to disagree with him. So Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian literature of this time, of the 19th or the 20th century, demonstrates vitality and even dominance of miasmatic theory about spreading epidemics as a result of this influence of bad air and unhealthy atmosphere. Our examples proved the same that examples from other literatures, that contagious and miasmatic were almost synonyms, at least by the mid or even by the late 19th century. On the other hand, we see very progressive views, very progressive samples about new inventions by scientists, about progress in this fight with diseases, with epidemics. And I can bring an example, the novel by Vasyl Korolev-Stary. It's rather less known author, and his novel Chmerlik, in translation, A Little Bumblebee. There, Vasyl Korolev-Stary mentions a German scholar, German scientist, chemist, and hygienist, Max Josef von Pettenkofer, and he mentions the experiments and advice for people to keep the living spaces clean in order to protect them from diseases. Therefore, Ukrainian authors are not only speaking about the past, but they give clue about a brighter future, which is possible if people, if readers of this text would change their views, their attitudes, and their behavior. And I would like to end with a few words regarding the current situation. Here is explanation of my title. So about current situation, Ukrainian literature gives us examples that we are exactly facing very similar things that Ukrainians, Europeans, and people from other continents met and experienced 200 years ago. This experience made us who we are, those who wash their hands before eating, those who is used to immunize at least several times in a lifetime, if not every year. The optimistic side is that, optimistic side of our presence, of our current events, is that our scientists and even sometimes our authorities much better understand what needs to be done in this situation of epidemics, of pandemic. And this time, very quickly, really quickly, we received a possible solution. I mean, this innovative vaccines. It not was like this in previous centuries, for sure. And what we have experienced in the last months and last year, it was quite unpleasant experience, but that should not be forgotten. All these myths, all these legends, all these rumors about COVID, they should be studied by folklorists. And I'm sure, and my hope is that our writers, present writers and artists are preparing interesting forms of what that would present recent events and that would present the mood of our times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmytro. Maybe, do you mind stop sharing your screen at this point? Thank you. Thank you. We can proceed to our questions, to our discussion. And while we're waiting for the questions, well, I'm very happy that you finished your presentation with this comment on the current situation. And it, to some extent, it prompted my question. When I was listening to your presentation, many things are quite interesting and intriguing. And you presented a fascinating collection of passages from literature that provide some comment on the pandemics. But it does look like they are united by common topics. One of them is that pandemics were very severe in rural areas, that pandemics revealed social discrimination and ethnic discrimination as well. Also, poor hygiene was pointed out, as well as poor residents who were subject to pandemics more likely than richer residents. But, and all these topics were commented on by Western European writers and Ukrainian writers as well. I was wondering if they commented on how government reacted to the pandemics when they were breaking out, because yes, you did mention that there was discrimination, therefore probably the rural areas were not of concern to governments. But did Ukrainian writers made any comment on whether governments should somehow introduce some social changes, or they should change their policies? I suspect probably Franko would make comments on that because he was very active in terms of social and political activities. But what about others?
You know, it's very precise, actually, that we have a very little evidence about that side, but exactly in Franko's text, we have something. For instance, it might be, again, this Serhy Yekelchyk, he wrote that local authorities were thinking what should be done. They tried to prevent this massacre, this burning of people, but they failed. They were not that powerful to prevent this. And not only authorities, but also a clergy. It was a high level of mistrust in front of authorities, in front of clergy even. And in Galicia, there were cases like the chairman of monastery he had to hide himself by the walls of monastery in order to not be punished, to not be catched by this mistrust peasants, because they thought he was a chef of uperi of this ghouls. In other texts, there were very few samples because the presence of authorities in Ukrainian village of that time, it wasn't that high. Nobody know who is actually authorities. So they have too many problems, too many issues in addition to all these epidemics. So it was only one of the bad sides of their life, unfortunately, one of the many bad sides. Yeah.
Thank you, Dmytro. We have a question from Bogdan Oreshkevich. Is there any mention in Ukrainian literature of the Russian influenza pandemic of 1889, 1819? This may have been a coronavirus.
1889, yes.
1889, 1819.
In the text I mentioned, they were mostly, as you might admit, they were mostly prose texts. There were not mentions about this, but we do not have these cases like in Koniski text when he put the data. So sometimes it's kind of universal image, and if we would take the letters of the writer and we will explore them and search and mention that it was exactly that year, that particular year, then we might trace and find some exclusive, some interesting sites of this particular wave, of this particular outbreak of cholera or some other disease. So it was without these frameworks as a rule, sometimes precise, as in case with Franko and Koniski, but as a rule, it wasn't like this. It was kind of more universal. And even the name of this epidemics was unknown to people, so they prefer to use plague. And what is interesting, if you take these translations, English translations of Ukrainian literature, we will see that translators use again plague for cholera or for poshest, in Russian povetria. So poshest became a plague. It's not like this for me, but translators use this word.
Well, today many mention isolation as one of the very strong consequences and very problematic issues with which we have to deal today in terms of a pandemic. And in your presentation, you also did mention this this comment on isolation in Kobylianska's work and a little bit in Shevchenko when you were talking about Chumak. And I'm wondering to what extent isolation was really prevalent in the 19th century, because when you were enumerating some measures which were implemented, they sounded familiar to some extent. For example, you mentioned that some areas were restricted, that they were supposed to be wearing some protective clothes and so on. But even from those passages that you brought, there is some description of the situation, particularly, I would say, in the middle of the 19th century. And then we move towards some psychological, let's say, psychological processing of the pandemic. So in terms of this psychological effects, psychological consequences, how much of isolation can we say that it was a problem, or it was something, even if it was something that residents and those who were suffering from the pandemics were reflecting on?
Thank you for this. Another interesting question. You know, I would start that what triggered my interest in this topic, what made me interested in this is it wasn't just an outbreak of this today's coronavirus, but of course it was as well. But it was a striking rereading of this Shevchenko's text Чума, where he wrote "Неначе злякані ягнята позамихалися у хатах." And I was actually, as many Ukrainians, I was locked in my apartment and I was afraid, of course. So this kind of isolation in very physical description, kind of quarantines, we cannot meet them on the pages of poetry, for sure, not in the poetry. That might be in realistic prose, but not in romanticist poetry. We have only traces, only kind of hints about this, and more about emotional status of people of the time. And I think it's indeed more interesting, at least for me, to read about emotions of people, because if I would like to read about the restrictions of authorities, I will take this textbook or monograph about this particular period. But emotions, they were surprisingly identical to not only Ukrainians to Ukrainians from different centuries, but Ukrainians to British people, to Algerians or French people in Iran. So it was a striking point of these findings.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would say that there is more of fear in the 19th century rather than some anxiety or loneliness, right? But that passage that you brought from Camus was saturated with this kind of anxiousness, right? And with that kind of isolation and anxiety over isolation. I have one more question about how Ukrainians were dealing with these pandemics when there was actually no help from the authorities. Do you have any evidence on how these pandemics were commented by знахарі or представники народної медицини, how we would put it in Ukrainian?
It's an interesting question because actually these witch doctors or healers, village healers, they always have the solutions, and they always have to propose something for the peasants. But my impression from the literature is that folklore may tell us more about this particular things, because there we can see how these elderly women, or it's always women who helps to surpass this plague, to fight against any disease. And in literary texts we see samples, but not only when it's talking about epidemics, but about other diseases, when characters from at start they always believe in healers, but afterwards they have very bad consequences. And sometimes when they prefer to choose, when they have to choose between the doctor and these healers, in the later samples of literature, I mean literature of the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, we have this image of much better doctor, much better physician, and much worse healer, for instance, in Borys Hrinchenko's novels.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. During your presentation, there was this one moment when there is some sense of hopelessness. One of the writers noted that it was a never-ending pandemic. And again, well, it does reveal a lot about how residents were just left alone with these struggles, and how they had to somehow survive, and at some point even just to accept it as their everyday. And I think that it's very pertinent. Unfortunately, it's very pertinent to today's Ukraine as well, especially with this very problematic process of vaccination and very problematic process of dealing with pandemic situation where lockdowns are introduced, but then how people are supposed to survive under these circumstances. This brings me to your last comment that this pandemic should be also explored by ethnographers or by anthropologists and by literary scholars as well, through all kinds of documents, maybe if not novels or poems, but human documents, we can put it this way. So what's your prediction? What will be paid attention to in terms of literary developments that would somehow respond to the current pandemic?
So, in my view, we do have many evidences about these epidemics of the past in literature, in pictures, of course, in paintings, mm-hmm. Quite a few of them, but not as many in music, not as many in monuments. I mentioned about this at the very beginning. What I mean here is that for ongoing pandemic, I would expect quite the same thing, because I'm not aware of your experience, but I have heard only about one idea of constructing a monument and somewhere in South America, just one. I have heard about initiatives from the community of co-workers of museums, for instance. So I'm sure that our writers would provide us a lot of work for us as literary scholars, as cultural scholars. But I would like to see more samples of reimagination and presenting of epidemics of this coronavirus in music. It's very hard. It's hard even to imagine how to reveal it in this form. And in monuments. Why in monuments? Because these are the places, the sites where everyone can came and to think about his own or her own experiences and about those who remained, who are not with us this year and who remained in these years and these months of this passed away people.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, I'm still dwelling on your idea about monuments. It's also about some social remembering, right? What we remember and what we forget, and also in terms of how we will remember this pandemic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dmytro, for your wonderful presentation and for sharing your research and for introducing us to the Ukrainian writers' memories on the pandemics in the 19th century. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Natalia.
Today, Dmytro Yesypenko presented his talk, There is Nothing New Under the Sun, Ukrainian Writers on the Epidemics of the 19th Century. Thank you so much for attending our lecture today. Information about upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for our future events, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.